Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Definitely, I think there's enough room for everyone, so we're real excited that we had such a nice turnout tonight. And just want to start by thanking everybody who's been instrumental in making this happen. Jen Risley, Jen, are you here somewhere? And Todd Horner, Todd, you must be here somewhere too. There's Todd in the back. Both of these folks worked tirelessly to fundraise, because that was the first goal, and also to get the word out so we could fill the room. The event's also being live streamed, so everyone else who's not here can see it, so we're excited about that. I'd like to thank the Keene Downtown Group, who was the primary sponsor. And for those of you who don't know much about us, the common perception is we're a group of downtown business merchants, but we're actually an association that wants to have more residents as members and increase the population base of the group. So anybody who's interested in joining or being part of us, we'd love to hear you, talk to you, meet you. Again, contributions came from all sorts of people, banks, small companies, large companies, lots of individuals. So thank you to all who helped make that happen. Much appreciated. And in terms of how and why Jeff is here, I read Jeff's book, Walkable City, about 10 years ago. And I was kind of very taken with it, but I didn't really understand if all those things could actually happen in a town the size of Keene. From what I've seen of Jeff's work, he works in larger cities. But over the past 10 years, I've made a point of kind of looking at some of the cities he's worked in and seeing how those cities come away both culturally, with more vibrancy, but economically they come away stronger. More businesses, more residents, more restaurants, more people out walking the streets. So when a few of us realized, oh, maybe Jeff would come visit us for a day, we got very excited. So Keene is wonderful. It needs world-class ideas. You know, we're a world-class city. Jeff brings those ideas to the table. So without further ado, here is Jeff Speck.
Thank you, Roger. I think I have to jack this up. Bend over. Can you hear me if I stand up straight? I learned from, oh, it's still on? Is that good? Yeah. I learned from karaoke, you have to hold it like this. You can't hold it. Hi, everybody. Wow. What a great crowd. Thanks so much to Roger, who I think did a lot of the labor and enthusiasm to make this happen. Also, Mayor Hansel, thank you, City Manager Dragon. We've all spoken before. And this is the first time I've ever spoken in a place where my lecture was crowdfunded, which it says more about you guys than about me. But I also noticed, this is one of the few places, and I'm from New England, so I can have fun with you. I noticed that this is one of the few places where there was a notice in the paper that some city councilors or other important people had said they didn't think that it was necessarily worth it. And so I've worked so hard on this lecture. I put so much effort into this lecture because I want to prove to you that it was worth it. And I hope by the end you feel that it was worth it. I'm super excited about your potential. Sure, I mean, a lot of places I work in have bigger populations than Keene, but not many of them have a downtown as substantial and nice as you have. So, and I think Roger would agree that I hope that you agree by the end of the night that most of the issues that I raise, even though the examples might be from bigger cities, not all of them are, that they are applicable here in Keene. Also, because I'm working so hard and I want to get your money's worth, this is going to be a marathon tonight. I'm going all night. And I'm joking, but my lecture will be a little bit long. I promise it'll be entertaining, but because I spent so much time looking at things, there's just a lot to say. And Roger actually said, are you going to give us some plans? As in, Jeff, you must give us some plans. So I'll be showing you some proposals as well. So aside from the books, I think I have two credentials for being here. One is that, I've been doing this for about 30 years, and I do a lot of plans for new places. This is Rosemary Beach in Florida. I do a lot of plans to enhance existing places. This is Carmel, Indiana, a new street that we made. That's one thing. I think my other main quality is that I've had a cabin in New Hampshire for 50 years. So if you get on 101 and just keep going for an hour and a half east to Lake Pawtuckaway. So I've been coming to New Hampshire since I was a little kid. And I think for tax purposes, we'll end up being a New Hampshire resident before too long. So let's get right into it. You're starting with so much. You have a downtown that's already walkable. I lectured in Mansfield, Texas last week, and my starting slide was towards a walkable Mansfield, because they're not walkable yet. You get the more walkable because you are already so walkable. Wonderful downtown. It didn't hurt that today was the first day of student orientation, I guess, so there were a ton of kids and other people walking around. Wonderfully shaped streets. The police are looking after the troublemakers, and everything seems to be going right here. In my book, Walkable City, which we just came out with the 10th anniversary edition, which you'll see outside, I basically do two things. I talk about why it's so important for us to make our cities more walkable, and I talk about how to make our cities more walkable. You're not going to get the why lecture tonight. And it's been an evolution, I think, over 10 years of going to communities and finding out I don't really need to convince people anymore, right? Most people, at least the ones who show up at my lectures, know that they want their cities to be more walkable, but I should just comment briefly that story is really the story of having, been preaching for more walkable places for many years and having had limited success in convincing people. And then discovering these three groups, the economists, the environmentalists, and the epidemiologists, who were each arguing from their own playbook for the same thing that we were arguing for, but much more convincingly. So the economists telling the story about how, the typical working American actually can't afford to drive, but does it anyway. We used to spend 10% of our income on transportation, and now we spend 20% of our income on transportation because of the way that we've organized our communities around driving. And there's, of course, a lot more to say about that. I don't need to discuss the environmental arguments, except to say that most of us, the principal way that we contribute to climate change is the driving we do. So we start there when we try to lighten our footprint. And then finally, the epidemiologist's story about how we currently, this was 20 years ago. So now we have the second generation of American kids who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents. And they tell us it's for one main reason is that we've engineered out of existence the useful walk in our communities. And so since walking serves no purpose, people don't do it. They go to the gym, for a month after New Year's, and then they just settle back into the inactive lifestyle. So if you want to hear more of that story, it is a TED Talk that you can find at TED.com under my name. But let's move right on to how to do it and what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, which is what I call my general theory of walkability. And the general theory of walkability is how the book is organized. It's how this lecture tonight is organized. And it asks the question, in America, where driving is so easy and so cheap, and it's tremendously subsidized, and the car is sitting there in the driveway between you and everything, it's just so easy to fall into it. Against this landscape, how do we get people to make the choice to walk? And the answer is that the walk has to be as good as the drive. And for the walk to be as good as the drive, in places that we hope to make walkable, it has to do four things simultaneously. The walk has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. So I'm going to walk you through, no pun intended, I'm going to walk you through each one of those categories and talk a little bit how it applies to Keene. The useful walk is a story I heard from my mentors, Andres Guani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg. They were the founders of the New Urbanist movement many years ago that I joined very early on. And Andres used to give this talk he called The Story of Planning. and how back in the 19th century, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, and the planners, who weren't yet called planners, said, hey, let's move the housing away from the factories. And they did that, and the Garden City movement was born. Lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and the planners were hailed as heroes, and we like to say they've been trying to repeat that experience ever since. So the onset of Euclidean zoning, the separation of the landscape into large areas of single use, this guarantees an unwalkable solution, an unwalkable outcome. Now, we all know as planners now, and when we're taught planning in school, that this is wrong. This is not taught anymore. But typically when I arrive on a place to do a plan, there's already a plan in place, and it looks like this. Now, I was an art history major, which they say wasn't the most lucrative choice, but I can tell you that when you're planning a community, you don't want a Rothko. You want a Syrah, right? And Syrah was the pointillist. And if this isn't actually a zoning map, this is an actual use map of Manhattan. And you see the more confetti-like, the finer grain the uses are, of course, the more useful a place is to walk around. And this is deceiving because that red color is actually vertically mixed use with one thing on top of another. So that's the model, and that kind of gets us to the fundamental new urbanist argument, which we put in our book, Suburban Nation, where we tell the story of how there are really only two ways to build communities. Actually, there's 1,000 ways to build communities, but there's only two that we've tested by the thousands. One is the traditional neighborhood, and the other is suburban sprawl. These are the only two models that we've built to a great degree. Does anyone recognize this neighborhood? This is Newburyport. We've been showing this for 30 years. The traditional neighborhood is defined as being diverse, compact, and walkable. So you see in this image, big houses, small houses, places to work, places to shop, places to worship, places to recreate. It's also several neighborhoods of Newburyport next to each other. A typical traditional neighborhood is about a 5-minute walk from edge to center, or a half-mile across. And you find that across cultures throughout history. It's also walkable because there's lots of streets. And because there's lots of streets, no one street needs to be very big. By the way, I have allergies. I'm not dying up here, but I will be coughing. In contrast to the traditional neighborhood is sprawl, clearly not compact, thus the name, right? Not diverse. The whole square mile might hold just one use. In this case, it's just houses. And it's particularly not walkable because get my pointer going here. Because the very few streets actually connect. They're loops or dead ends. So all the traffic of the metropolis is on these very few, very big streets. You'll notice there are no addresses on these streets. Walls and backs of buildings. The houses turn their backs on them. And they're designed strictly for the motion of vehicles. They serve no other purpose. We call them traffic sewers. So that's the model. According to Adam Rune's Everything, you're 290% more likely to be killed by a car in this environment than in this environment. So those are the two models. Excuse me for 1 second. I do have water. So it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts. You have the, that was where I was last week, in McAllen, Texas. You have places where you only live, places where you only work, places where you only shop. Schools get bigger and bigger and therefore further and further away. When you consolidate schools, you lengthen trips of buses and typically the school kids driving themselves. Consolidation of sports facilities as well. And it's wonderful that there are 8 baseball diamonds and 8 soccer fields here in West Fort Lauderdale, but the kid who lives here actually has a 2-mile drive to get to the game there. I mapped it, right? And this seems preposterous, like how could they do this? But if you begin with the assumption that every trip is a car trip, then decisions like these actually happen naturally and don't seem so silly when you're making them. So if you separate everything, this is LA, of course. If you separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system gets bigger and bigger. It's the part that we forgot to count, right? If the planners had thought about the 13 car trips per day that a typical suburban house would generate, those are one-way trips. So I guess someone's not getting home at night. But, you know, the highway system, which was created for commerce and for vacation travel, has become a commuting way. So I always tell people it's a two-part deal. A lot of people want this, but you can't have this without this. The dream, the American dream of the house with nothing else but houses around it, becomes the nightmare of being stuck in traffic. Often to absurd extremes. This is outside of Boston. But the amount that we spend on our horizontal infrastructure so that you never have to wait more than one cycle at a light, right? Because the environment is so banal and mind-numbing that if you have to sit there for more than one light, you just want to kill yourself. So that can't be allowed to happen. So, this is not Photoshop. Walter Kulash in Florida took this slide a while back. It's stressful on families. The longer, this is a fact, the longer your commute, the more likely you are to end up divorced. And of course, this is the slide I got from the epidemiologists. And they tell us, we've been showing this for 20 years, they tell us, you know, the fact that you park, you drive to park, to take the escalator, to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, is why we have an unhealthy society. So driving is no fun, being a pedestrian can be worse. And these are the two models. And I'm ending the segment of the talk about making new places. But we are building the equivalent of new towns all around America every day, but we're just building the pieces and not the towns. But these are the two models. And if you're making a new place, you should sear this image into your brain because it shows that it's the same stuff. The traditional neighborhood and sprawl is the same stuff. But how big is it? How far apart is it? This slide actually exaggerates the closeness of these pieces to each other. And then importantly, is there a dendritic? Is there a branching road system, local, collector, arterial, highway, and back again, where there's one path from anywhere else? Or do you have a nice fine-grained network of small blocks? Because the great irony of sprawl is that it was designed for cars, and yet it works worse for cars. Because if you have one engine fire on this collector road, your city basically shuts down for an afternoon. Whereas there's 21 ways to get from down here to up there in a neighborhood that was designed around walking. So these are the two models. But let's move on to existing places like your downtown. Looking from the north, a little confusing at first, but yeah, this is the north to south view. When you're trying to, remember, we're in the first category here, the useful walk. When you're trying to make a place really useful, you look at all the different uses and you say, what's missing? How's the balance? What are we short of? Most American downtowns are short on housing, particularly in the centers of the city. There was a tradition in the US, of course, of CBDs, right, central business districts that might just be office. We experienced white flight, which had a big impact on our downtowns. When you bring the housing back, of course, everything gets better in a downtown. Jane Jacobs famously, looking at Wall Street around 1960, she asked, 400,000 people are coming to Wall Street to work every day. Why does Wall Street not have a single great restaurant? Why does Wall Street not have a single great gym? It does now, right? But this was 1960, and she said, what's missing is time spread. You need people there in the evening. That's what she called it, time spread. You need people there in the evening as well. You need a good restaurant or a good gym needs a dinner crowd as well as a lunchtime crowd. And so the way you make a downtown sing is by putting more housing in it. And you can't invite them downtown for special events in the theater and church. You really need to put the housing in the downtown itself. A number of cities I've worked in, like Des Moines, are actively subsidizing the creation, renovation of buildings, adaptive reuse, or new construction of housing in their downtown. So Des Moines had 10 years of tax abatement, 10 years of tax increment financing on top of that. Of course, no parking requirement, which I've heard you have in your downtown, which is really important to getting more housing. Because if someone lives in your downtown now, you've got every city I'm in would kill for your grocery store, right? In the heart of downtown. It's fantastic. So your co-op. So you can live downtown without a car, but luckily you don't require that. And they they basically quadrupled the amount of housing in their downtown by actively supporting it in their downtown. So you have more housing coming. This is right behind the old middle school. it's not beautiful, but that makes me happy because that means it's probably more affordable than it would be otherwise. And this is the kind of housing that downtowns need. You'll always have a few, Corten steel-clad condos of the rich, but what you really want is lots of people of moderate means who can really take advantage of that car-light existence in your downtown. And by moderate, I mean medium. I don't mean low. But the attainable, probably not subsidized, although that's welcome too, right? But attainable market rate housing in downtowns is what most cities need right now. And you have a lot of open space in your downtown that's available. You also have this block here that's just a one-story building compared to all the historic taller buildings around. This building is just one story, could be replaced. And so I just had a little fun. I had an hour extra. I had a little fun. You've got this giant double parking lot to the west of Main Street. So you'll notice what I did here. I photoshopped, I copied this building, this parking lot, right? It's a little long. Oh, by the way, you should never build a 2-story parking deck. You should either have a surface parking lot or a 5-story parking deck. 2-story parking deck is the least economical way to provide parking, except going underground. But lesson learned, right? So the typical way that developers build these days, and a lot of my clients, are that they build 5-story parking decks. We'll talk about this. They hide the parking from the street with a thin liner, and then they have a donut or something like it that has a lot of apartments in it that takes advantage of the parking that's very close by. So for example, here's one thing that you could do, roughly a 5-story building, beautiful courtyard, parking across the street that serves also the supermarket as well as the new housing. That's one site. Here's another site, right? I'm just cloning the parking lot and moving it all around town. Now there is lower density stuff you could do that would not need structured parking. There's even, if a developer is willing, you could do high density without parking. That's harder to get financed, but of course that's the dream, if you can make it happen. And if a developer's willing to come in and give you higher density without parking, you should encourage that. Here's another site, here's another site, here's another site, right? I have a drawing that shows all of these together, but I will not show it to you because you'll be really angry. To see how much density can go in your downtown. But the point isn't that it's all going to happen. The point is that these are all sites that might be more or less available for housing, and every one of these would bring more life, more people, more affordability to your downtown. Also, we're going to make your downtown better, and so there is a real fear of displacement. There is. And so the way to stem displacement, one of several ways to stem displacement as you make a place better, is to add a ton more housing. So I think that has to be part of any serious recommendation for downtown. And it can be tall. Unlike many other places I work, you've got 5-story buildings. Your best buildings are your tallest buildings. I don't think anyone minds that this is a 5-story building, right? Your best buildings are tall buildings. You have that already. So that's the first category, the useful walk. Now we're going to move on to the big category where I spend most of my time, which is the safe walk. I collect these, there it is, the little out of order. I collect these, I want to say something about the safe walk. The categories are useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. The useful, comfortable, and interesting walk are pretty much all a factor of what is surrounding the streets themselves, and it's pretty much the private sector. It's mostly the private sector. The public sector can incentivize, the public sector can change zoning to encourage the right buildings, framing public space, but that's private sector, it takes longer. I spend most of my time working in cities on the safe walk because that's something the city can change immediately. And we still do 20-year plans, Planning is typically a 20-year exercise, but most places I work, the leaders want change before the election. And people realize, they want more walkability now. They want it as soon as possible. So the way to do that quickly is to change the design of your streets. So I spend a lot of my time on the safe walk, and I collect these images off the internet of all the things that cars do when they go too fast, trying to make other cars. It's crazy how drive-through pharmacy, how much collision, Lone Star collision. I was from Texas. This one I don't really understand. But Sorry, I'll move on. The way we drive in America is a function of the way we design our streets in America. And I don't have time tonight to take you into the whole story of how American, really North American, street engineering is just a fundamentally different approach than European street engineering. But the basic story is that we design our streets to be forgiving, and they invite high speeds. And so this extra elbow room makes our streets very dangerous, but particularly dangerous for pedestrians. I updated this for 2021. The data is rolling in for 2022, and I believe that 2022 will be 100% more deadly to be a pedestrian than in 2009. So in 14 years, we've basically doubled the risk of death to being a pedestrian in the US. And there's a number of factors that have contributed to this. The best book about it is called Right of Way by Angie Schmidt. She talks about the suburbanization of poverty, the fact that we now have poor people who don't own cars living in the AutoZone, right? Living in a place that was never meant to be walked around, that was designed entirely with the presumption everyone would be driving everywhere. But now people of less means have been forced into the suburbs. And so you have this condition where they're trying to walk in these unsafe places. That's the second biggest factor. Say you want to guess the biggest factor. Oh wait, yeah, sorry, look for the crosswalk. Because these places don't have crosswalks. The biggest factor is the rise of SUVs and large trucks, which are much more dangerous, harder to stop, greater kinetic energy. You end up under it rather than on the hood. And there's not too much we can do about that, except personally. When Angie Schmidt when her book came out, actually, I did this partially for professional self-preservation, but when her book came out, I sold my SUV and bought a station wagon. Because I didn't want to be the one who hit a pedestrian with an SUV. And then also there's what they call the front overs, the number of collisions. It's gone from just a few a year to hundreds a year of people being killed because they can't be seen. These 12 kids cannot be seen in front of this Escalade. So it's a real problem. There's not too much we can do about it. These are the crashes in your downtown over 3 years. And there's a lot of them. Happily, there's no fatalities. No fatalities. I'm sorry to say that's probably a temporary condition, right? Because it's just so dangerous in our streets right now. And a lot of these injuries, these non-fatal injuries, they're still a very big deal. 40,000 Americans are dying every year on the road. Several million Americans are being permanently injured every year on the road. And we take it as natural, we just kind of shrug it off. But in fact, there's a lot that we can do about it by modeling ourselves over places that have done something about it. And the most important thing is vehicle speed. A car going 35 miles an hour is 8 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. And a car going 20 or 15 miles an hour is probably not going to kill anyone. Because first of all, it'll have the opportunity to brake, and second of all, the kinetic energy isn't that high. So what are we able to control in our inhabited areas? In the areas that we want to be walkable, what are we able to manipulate so that in those places, not over the whole city, not on the highway, not places where you just want to get through, but in those places, those few places in our community that have the opportunity to be walkable, what can we change? The first one is the number of lanes. Obviously, more lanes makes it look more like a highway. Drivers go faster when they have more lanes. It takes you longer to cross the street. This is Oklahoma City. The mayor called me in, this was about a dozen years ago, because Prevention Magazine named Oklahoma City the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country, which wasn't a nice thing to read. It wasn't true. I mean, if you've been to like Lawton, Oklahoma, or some other places, but the mayor said, "What do we do?" And I said, "Let's do a walkability study." And he said, "What's that?" And I said, "I don't know, but let's figure it out together." And I've since done 15 of them. We just finished up Hyannis, and I did one in Lowell a number of years ago that changed the traffic patterns in Lowell, Mass. So we look at these car counts. I don't know if you can see them, 5,000, 6,000. And we know that a 2-lane road can handle 10,000 cars per day without turn lanes. A typical 2-lane road can handle two-way traffic, no extra turn lanes at intersections for 10,000 cars per day, up 10,000 cars per day. And these were streets that in their current plan were designated. We're currently 4 to 6 lanes and we're designated to stay that way.
and these were their car counts. So we said we got a massive mismatch here between traffic and volume, and we can change the volume to match the traffic that you have, and that's what we do in most places. We don't tell places to reduce, to cause congestion. We just say, let's meet the current traffic with the appropriately sized road network for that traffic. But this is important, we look at it network-wide, because sometimes it makes sense to, and I'm gonna talk about this, it makes sense, if I forget, remind me, it makes sense to shift trips sometimes from one street to another street. But we were very lucky in that when we finished the study, Devon Energy was building this 50-story tower downtown, generating $200 million in tax increment, and they said, what do we spend it on? And we decided to rebuild, they decided to rebuild from building to building every right-of-way, 40 blocks in the downtown core. And so my job was the curb design. I was able to eliminate 30% of the lanes. We doubled the amount of on-street parking, which was great for businesses. We added a bike network where there was no bike network. So a typical street went from this to this. Here it is under construction. This 4-lane one-way became this 2-laner, 2-way plus train. This street became this street. You get the idea. This is what you do when you have money, and they have money to spend. Most of the plans I do in communities focus principally on restriping and not repaving. In this case, you're tearing up a street, so you have the opportunity to repave. We do a lot of restriping because you can restripe a lot more than for the same amount of money, you can restripe a lot more than you can repave. So when you look at Main Street, you can see actually it's got 10,000 trips coming northbound, 9,000 trips going southbound. This is more than a 2-lane road, obviously. So, but the question is, what fits? What fits a little bit less than 20,000 trips? And the answer is found in this chart. These are 21 streets that were all converted from various widths to 3-lane roads, 2 lanes plus a turn lane. One remarkable thing is that the number of trips after the conversion is as many as the one was before. So we did not, I didn't do any of these streets, but when they converted these streets, they did not reduce the throughput. They did not reduce the capacity in a meaningful way of the street. And then look at the numbers, 24, 20, 16, 18, 21, 18, 17, 21, 23. This is all pretty much in keeping with your Main Street. So this tells me that your Main Street could function if the intersections are handled properly with turn lanes. At the major intersections, that your Main Street could be a 3-lane road instead of or really a 2-lane road plus turn lanes versus what it is now, which is a 4-lane road plus some turn lanes. And notice one of the lanes isn't even being used, right? Yeah. Just the way it happens to be organized. Yes, you have these queues at rush hour, but they're in 1 lane only. So that tells you a lot right there. And then here's a key point I want to make. So you're probably aware that Stantec is, some of you may be aware, Stantec is doing your plan for rebuilding this street. They're a very good company. I've worked with them plenty through the years. Everything I've told you, they would tell you, but they kind of stop there because they're a big engineering company and they love doing traffic studies. And any firm that does traffic studies isn't going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, which is traffic studies are bullshit. And traffic studies are bullshit because of a number of reasons, but they don't consider that demand is dynamic. It so happens the amount of traffic you have on your street is the exact amount of traffic that people are willing to put on it because they're willing to wait in that traffic. And when you change the capacity of a street, as long as the network still functions, when you change the capacity of a street, people adjust their behavior. And particularly now with Waze, people adjust their behavior. They don't even try. So check this out. I Googled, I wanted to get from Papagallo's restaurant down here to Boston Hedgehogs, which sounds fascinating. So I charted a course through your Main Street, and it takes 10 minutes. But then I charted a course up Route 9, and it takes 10 minutes. And I charted a course up whatever this is, past Washington Park, and it takes 10 minutes. This is no accident. And what's going to happen, actually, whether you're keen enough, wrong turn, to take the diversion, Waze is going to be causing other people to take the diversion, and it's a self-adjusting system. And the point I want to make, I'll stress it later, is you have only one chance to have a downtown. It's not on Route 9, it's not in Robin Hood Park. You know, your city has one heart and one chance to be special, it already is, and that's your Main Street. So you should make your Main Street what you want it to be, understanding that actually the traffic will be flexible. But I'm going to say all that and then dial it back and say, I'm not recommending less capacity on your Main Street than the trips that are there currently, okay? But I am saying that a 3-laner works, and that really opens the door in terms of what your Main Street can be, for the reasons I said. Now, there are other streets with more lanes than they need. West Street probably needs a left turn lane as it approaches Main Street, but it does not need a left turn lane all the way deep down into this picture. And so actually, you've got these 3 fat lanes on West Street, 13 foot, 12 foot, 13 foot. You know, these stores are all dead. Well, I'm sorry, they're not dead, but they look like they're really suffering because they have no parking in front. In fact, I was surprised to see the stores don't seem to be empty. In most communities, when you have this condition, the stores can't survive. But for the same amount of roadway, you can change this. Once you get a little bit from the corner, you can change this 3-laner to this standard width Main Street park, drive, park configuration. So I would recommend that. Further west on West Street, you have a very interesting condition, which is a long stretch of 4 lanes. The 4-laner is about the dumbest kind of road you can have. It's very dangerous because one car stops for you and the next car hits you. But it's also very inefficient because the turn lane is also the speeding lane is also the turning lane, right? So there's this thing called the classic American road diet. I alluded to it earlier, where a 4-laner becomes a 3-laner. So you get 10 extra feet for bike lanes or something else, and you make the street safe by having a shared center turn lane. No one is surprised that these streets are so much safer. When you do this, the accidents, the crashes drop precipitously. But for the reasons, you know, there's just so many fewer conflict opportunities. But this chart, again, shows you that there's no reduction in capacity. So that's something that's available for that full stretch of west, from just off of the highway. What is it, 12 over there? 9. That's 9. From 9, whatever it is, on the west, all the way to where it becomes a 3-laner. That 4-lane section could be a 3-lane section, and I think I forgot to draw it. Oh no, here it is. This whole stretch from about a long block from the highway, all the way to basically School Street. It's this now, 4 wide lanes, and it could be this. But look at these wonderful 6-foot bike lanes with 5-foot buffers. Could be along that street. And it will not reduce the capacity, and this is one of these solutions that's just paint. All you can do is put down a new top coat and stripe it yourselves. Incidentally, Main Street from 101 to the roundabout and beyond also has that condition. It's a little bit trickier because it also has a median in some places, which would have to change. I don't like pulling out trees, so I'm not sure what the solution is here, but just know that you've got another 4-laner that could be a 3-laner somehow. All right, so we talked about the number of lanes. Next up is the width of the lanes. My boss, Andre Suwani, used to show this slide, and he'd say, the typical subdivision in America is wide enough to allow you to experience the curvature of the earth. And it's true. Because the standards have changed. So this is a neighborhood from the 60s, and this is a neighborhood from the 80s. Same height of airplane, same size of the house, but look what happened. And there's basically been this mission creep for a number of reasons where streets have gotten wider and wider. And what happens in wider streets? We go faster. The data are very clear. We know intuitively that a 10-foot lane is a 30, 40 mile an hour lane, and a 12-foot lane is a highway lane. It's a 70 mile an hour lane. And there's all these studies that correlate lane width to driving speed. And of course, as I've told you, speed is the biggest factor in mayhem in cities. Thank goodness for NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. They have now established 10 feet again as the standard. A lot of cities' standards are 11 feet or 12 feet. We're now going back to 10 feet as the standard. 10 feet is plenty.
You know, a truck next to a truck. And by the way, 7 foot most parking lanes are 8 feet, right? So this is a 10-footer next to a 7-footer. You can see that you have ample room to drive the right speed, right? Not to go fast, but to drive the speed that's appropriate for a city center. So here's West Street near Maine, that I already talked about, but notice it currently has 13-foot lanes. So that's a high-speed street. Emerald Street looks pretty tight, but in fact, you've got 2 13.5-foot lanes next to 1 parking lane, so you could fit parking. Okay, there's 7.5-foot spaces. This is more room than that street I just showed you with the 2 trucks in it, right? 7.5, 10, 10, 7.5. So you could bring parking to that south side of Emerald Street if you want. Speaking of parking, that's next on the list. Parallel parking is an essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles, any kind of parking. There are other ways to protect a sidewalk, but the easiest and most effective, particularly for merchants, way to protect a sidewalk is with this crust of parked cars. People don't know how important this is. This is Fort Lauderdale, where I did a walkability study that until I was done, you weren't allowed to park on this side of the street. And this is Hiberton Boulevard, famous for its happy hour. This is happy hour on the park side of the street. This is happy hour on the unparked side of the street. No one wants to be up against those cars moving quickly, and so that's a real lesson. The other part of the image, of course, is street trees. Street trees are really great for many reasons, which I'll talk about. But they're also great for safety. They used to be considered bad for safety because highway engineering thought was imported into city engineering thought. They're called FHOs, fixed hazardous objects, right? They were supposed to make crashes more likely. In fact, when you have a street, a number of studies were done, when you have a street where there's a segment that has trees and a segment that has no trees, there are more crashes on the segment that has no trees. Because trees slow cars down, sometimes dramatically. It's too bad, it's too bad this fellow, I'm gonna guess fellow, hit a tree, but better tree than a pedestrian. And of course, trees lined up in perspective almost form a wall between you and the street. So you don't have that parking, they can be really, really effective. This is an artist rendering that I'm sure came out of state DOT somewhere, probably Florida, about a theoretical possibility that would never happen. You know when that van went by, that man's bag just flopped in the wind, and there's no way people would be walking on this 5-foot sidewalk right up against a driving. Only DOTs are capable of producing drawing systems. Then this is getting a little subtle, there's vocabulary. What's the vocabulary of the street? This is Truth in Advertising. This is the Las Vegas Sun. It says at the bottom, some say the entrance to City Center is not inviting to pedestrians. You think? Whenever the landscape bespeaks the presence of automobiles, it doesn't feel like a pedestrian place. So how does it do that? With slip lanes, with amoebas, with stream-form geometrics. Anything swoopy is an automotive shape, and everything more rectilinear or prismatic is a pedestrian shape. And that's relevant a little bit to this conversation. I'll get to that. I'll get to roundabouts in a second. But this is what, for example, they're doing in Atlanta. This is the same place. They're closing their slip lanes because they not only do they communicate higher speed, but they allow cars to turn the corner without stopping, right? Without behaving at the light. And so roundabouts are super safe. There's no doubt. They're safe for pedestrians. They're safe for drivers. When there's a crash, you bring the tow truck and not the ambulance. But they're dynamic places. They don't feel particularly pedestrian. And in my more technical book, which I encourage the wonks among you to read, Walkable City Rules, it's got 101 rules in them, and one of them is use roundabouts with discretion. And I sing the praises of roundabouts and indeed their safety, but first of all, the pedestrian is going off axis, right? So the pedestrian motion is kind of second-class citizen. And then also, it's just it's a turbine. It's a dynamic place. I like to say roundabouts are the safest, most pedestrian-friendly automotive environment that you can create. And I in this rule, I recommend them for everywhere except main downtown shopping intersections where they don't communicate that sort of stasis that you want for the comfort and pleasure of pedestrians. So it's not the end of the world to have one of these in your downtown, but it's not the ideal walkable environment. And I think, you know, this roundabout that you have south of on Main Street, you can see that this doesn't really feel, this will become relevant again in a minute, it doesn't really feel like a downtown environment. This is the kind of thing that the engineers don't let you do anymore. This is a picture in Charleston. It's the kind of picture they put on posters to get people to come to Charleston. It's completely illegal because that church has stepped out into the middle of the street. The street curves around the church at a 5-mile-an-hour curve. But of course, no one has ever hit that church. In 150 years, no one has ever hit St. Philip's Episcopal because, you know, the traffic engineers are worried about the drunk at midnight. This is what keeps the drunk at midnight from driving too fast, right? And so there are these wonderful intersections we study when you're studying town planning, if your instructors are any good. You get books like this 1909 book by Raymond Unwin, where they show you all these interesting, like, honorific sites for honorable buildings, where you have vista terminations and weird angles. Many cities don't let you do this because of the expectation that it's more dangerous to have a weirdly shaped intersection, an expectation which actually almost never pans out in real life. We worked on Confusion Corner in Stuart, Florida. When we were doing a downtown plan, everyone said, you've got to fix Confusion Corner, until we looked at it and found that it was the safest, per vehicle, it was the safest intersection in town. Because it was confusing. Where are the most dangerous intersections? The FDOT, you know, the Florida DOT standards, where you've got one hand on the cell phone and one finger on the steering wheel, you don't have to pay attention. That's where people drive more dangerously. Does anyone know what happened in Sweden in 1982?
They changed the road from left.
This is the first time anyone's ever got that. They switched from driving on, this year, 67, right here. They went for, 82 was like airbags, or seat belts. And what you see here is the introduction of seat belts and the introduction of airbags. But what happened in 1967 was, as the woman noted, they switched driving on the other side of the street. And people were worried, so they drove more carefully. So that's why intersections like these are actually not so bad. And it becomes relevant because I believe I'll be proposing a slightly angled intersection for the top of your Main Street. Now, signals. This is not a roundabout signal, this is a piece of art. But I show this picture to remind us that we are generally over-signaled in the US, and you will particularly feel that way when you see the data, which is that there's been a number of studies since, but the big study was in 1997 around the fact that in 1972 they had to replace, the warranting rules changed, they had to replace 472 signals with all-way stop signs. Now, when you just pull out a signal, that can be a problem. When you put in a two-way stop sign, that's not necessarily safe for crossing, but an all-way stop sign is extraordinarily safe. What they found was for every intersection where they replaced the signal with a stop sign, crashes dropped by 1/4, severe injury crashes by 63%, and severe pedestrian injury crashes by 68%. So we're doing this everywhere. Our plan currently for downtown Hyannis on the Cape, we're removing 8 of the 9 downtown signals and replacing them with stop signs. Now, you can't have too much traffic. 20,000 cars per day like your Main Street, that's too much traffic. But there are other places in town where you should look and see if you could replace a signal with a stop sign. I took this, I think, in Eugene. You know, this is what I call the good city. It's just so, you know, the bicyclist feels free to go apparently the wrong way. Wheelchair users are comfortable. And I showed this slide to remind myself, I don't spend much time talking about ADA or wheelchair accessibility, simply because it's, first of all, it's the law, and you've got to do it. But secondly, because anything you do to make your city more walkable is going to make it more rollable, and anything you do to make your city more rollable will make it more walkable. And we need to remember that we're allies in this effort. So this is part of my plan, my walkability study for Albuquerque, in which I recommended that 17 of the signals be replaced by all-way stop signs, and they took me up on 11 of them. And this is the news station, the TV station, telling the second part of the story, which is first there was a rebellion. And, you know, first they banged the lights and put up the stop signs, and then there was a rebellion. and they bagged the signals and put the lights back on. And then there was a larger, louder rebellion because the drivers, look at this, it's stop signs, reinstall stop signs to reduce traffic pileup as well as speeding. And what the drivers realized is with a stop sign at every intersection, they were getting through the downtown faster than waiting at one light or waiting at multiple lights. And that's the kind of the great secret of stop signs is they actually make it faster as a driver as well. But you're trolling at this nice low speed through the downtown rather than speeding from light to light and running yellows. Bikes. Okay, here's the bike segment. I'll try to be quick. This bicycle I discovered in a museum in Paris is from 1896. It's basically my bike, right? The technology has not changed in 120 something years. But what has changed is the technology of bike lanes. And this is in Somerville, Mass. We're finally building bike lanes in America that were as good as I experienced in Berlin in the 90s. But we're doing it now. Out of the street, or in the street and protected. This is Prospect Park West in New York City. You can see they went from 3 lanes to 2 lanes, plus a protected bike lane. You pull the parking off the curb. You've probably seen these before. Of course, the number of cyclists tripled, speeding dropped precipitously, injury crashes dropped precipitously. But again, notice, people were just speeding from red to red. So even though there's one fewer lane in this street, the number of cars on this street and on parallel streets and the speed with which they got through the neighborhood did not change. So it's another win-win-win situation. This being New York City, there was a massive 5-year lawsuit, but eventually the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. But I show this picture to contrast it with this picture. Nobody wants their daughter in the door zone. It's just not a safe place to bike. We should generally try to avoid door zone bike lanes wherever possible, or lanes like this. This is a complete street, according to the guidebooks. But also, if you don't protect a lane, people put stuff in it. You know, they put trash cans in it, they put dumpsters in it. The Uber always parks in it, even though there's parking on the curb. This is my Uber, and I've stopped telling them where to park because I like my 5-star rating. But that's where the Uber parks. You know, buses in the lanes, unloading the van, the cop car in the lane, the pellet. This is ironic. But you know, it's just something always ends up in the bike. So you got to protect it. There's also the Shero, you know, put in the worst possible places. And we use Sheros on occasion where we have to do a merge or something unusual, some special condition, or an extremely slow speed street can have a Shero in it. But you never want to share a street like this. And actually a study found, about 5 years ago, a study found that Sheros make streets less safe. And I remember I was in Melbourne, and I went on Twitter, and I'm like, who can come up with a new symbol for the Shero? And someone came up with this symbol. But the winner was Queen Anne Greenways, who came up with the prayer. So we generally try not to use them in fast, wide streets like you have in Main Street, which is why I'm bullish on making this a 3-laner as well, as I suggested for West Street, further west. So this is in Somerville. We're doing them in Cambridge, Mass. as well. The new projects, we do have these standards. This is the project I showed very briefly in Carmel, Indiana, where we built a whole new street that has, it's overdone it with bike lanes everywhere that are well used. Again, going the wrong way, but hey, it's great. But nobody bikes in the winter. Welcome to Finland. Or Denmark, excuse me, the Danes waiting for better weather since 12,000. But you know, this is all very funny, but what matters is this chart. This is the hottest state to the coldest state in the US. And what bears no resemblance whatsoever to the temperature is the biking population. Because biking population, sure, topography matters, and temperature matters, snow matters certain months of the year. But it's really bike infrastructure that determines bike population. And the classic line is, you know, of course no one is biking. It's like saying, you know, or of course we shouldn't build a bike lane because no one's biking. It's like saying we shouldn't build a bridge because no one's swimming the river. Right? If it's not safe, people won't bike. And of course, there's no such thing as bad weather. It's bad here. I've learned that from you guys. But aren't bike facilities tools of gentrification for the elite? That's a concern. Most people think of this as the typical biker, you know, the mammal, the middle-aged male in Lycra. Statistically, this is a more typical biker, and this chart tells us that 38.5% of the people who bike to work in America are from the poorest 25% of income earners. So, at least nationwide, bike lanes are an equity investment. You know, they help those with the least the most. All right. Now, that was the largest category. The last two aren't that long. So I'm winding towards the end of part one of my talk. The comfortable walk, it's the most counterintuitive aspect of this conversation because we all love, you know, to climb Mount Monadnock and get big views of the horizon, but actually all animals, humans among them, were simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. The evolutionary biologists tell us all animals are seeking not just to see their predators before they're attacked, but also to know that their flanks are covered from attack. And that refuge, those edges, are what make you feel safe. And a plaza is only as good as its edges. A street is only as good as its walls. We've been talking about this for a long time. What's the best ratio of height to width? 1:1 was the Renaissance ideal. 3:1, great. 1:6, you kind of don't really feel enclosed anymore. You know, and you've got that wide Main Street, so it wants to have tall buildings on it. Trees help, of course. You know, 6:1, Salzburg, delightful. You know, that's as far north as New York, but it's delightful. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. This is Houston from the 80s. It's much better now, but I keep showing this slide to remind us that the surface parking lot is the principal villain in this. And you don't suffer from that too much here. But whenever you allow a building to pull back and the parking lot to go up against the street, you're of course making an unpleasant space, a space that doesn't contain you. You know, look at this. This is Madrid. I'm dying to go here because look, there isn't even a way out. It's you know, outdoor living rooms are what you're trying to make as planners. And I'm kidding, of course. There's portals through this, but this is how you contain space. Of course, many architects don't understand that and still make schemes like this with just kind of yawning spaces between buildings that don't hold you well. And I have 100 of these slides of just all the best places in the world. I won't name them, which, well, you might recognize this one, which just hold you so well. Yes, some of my own projects are in here. Germany, and dinner in Italy on the plaza. You know, just great places, outdoor living rooms, well-shaped places like you have on your Main Street, particularly when you have the taller buildings. And then you'll notice where the pedestrian experience ends. And it's where the first building heading south has been allowed to put the parking in front of the building. So you just can't let that happen if you want to have well-shaped spaces. I love this space, this alley. But I want to mention one other big thing in the comfort category, and that is trees, and how incredibly important trees are, and old trees, particularly, that you have in your Main Street. This is Greenville, South Carolina. Who's been to Greenville? Yeah. Who's heard of Greenville? It has this amazing reputation. Oh, this amazing green city. This Main Street. Well, actually, it's not a very green city, except for that one street. But it only takes one amazing street to build a reputation, and that's where everyone's walking, and they've got 1.5 miles of it. So that's a half-an-hour walk of beauty down this Main Street. And these trees are not all that old, and you can grow trees like this fairly quickly. But look at that. This is Rosemary Beach, that project of mine I showed before. We planted these trees 15 years ago, and these are live oaks, which grow slow. But it's transformed the experience of this county highway in 15 years. So if you make a concerted effort to plant right and properly and treat the soil right, you can have even more tree cover than you have now. What concerns me, this is the leading contender for your current plan for Main Street. What concerns me is it does save all of the flank trees. And I think any plan for Main Street needs to begin where your curbs currently are, right? In fact, I don't know, we were talking about this, Roger and I were talking about this earlier. I don't know the details of the engineering, but it'd be wonderful if all the old pipes could just be left and shut down, and the new pipes laid in the street, so that aside from getting into properties, you didn't need to mess with any of this periphery of the street. But you can see this plan wisely begins outside, if you can see, these are the planters. It wisely begins outside of the existing curves in terms of where now we're building a new bike lane and parking, but it pretty much destroys all the trees in the median. Now, a lot of these trees are ash, and they're probably gonna die anyway, but some of them aren't. This is the tree survey, and I do think a step needs to be taken where all the valuable, all the, what's the word I use? I forget. There's a word for special trees, but all the trees in the medium that aren't ash, that are quite good, we need to identify those and make sure we're not killing any unnecessarily with the plan, because I don't think you're aware, because I wasn't aware until quite recently, how super important these old growth trees are to the success of your downtown and this leafy, cool, really delightful experience. Finally, the interesting walk. We humans are social primates. Nothing interests us more than other humans. We need signs of humanity to want to walk through a place. Otherwise, we get bored, we turn around. I talked about one-to-one being the Renaissance ideal for a space. This is the Renaissance ideal. This is in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is a very walkable downtown. But no one wants to walk on this street that connects the two main hotels, because when one side of the street is an exposed parking deck, and the other side is a conference facility, apparently designed in admiration for the parking deck. It's boring. It's boring. You need activity, you need vertical action, not just horizontal action, and of course you need to hide your parking decks. And we've learned from Mayor Riley in Charleston, it only takes 30 feet of building, or even 20 feet of building to hide 300 feet of parking, just that thin crust. That's how we build now. When we make parking decks, we put housing up against the edge, or we preserve the old storefronts. I call this one the Chia Pet Garage in South Beach. You keep alive the edge against the streets. You have this one deck here that across from the Marriott that's exposed to the street and not an ideal thing to walk through. And then you have blank walls also. Of course, the solution for blank walls, as you know well here, is the mural. This is the American version, here's the European version. Keep it clean, keep it clean. But you've got a wonderful, as announced in the downtown core, you have a wonderful and still active mural program going. I was at the National Endowment for the Arts for 4 years, and I would tell people, I want to see you we'd give out grants for art. And I'd say, I want you to use your public art in a remedial way. In other words, what can you remedy with your public art? And mostly it's blank walls. So when you have a blank wall, to put a mural on it, even not a blank wall, to put a mural on it makes a really big difference. And there's active mural making happening every day in your city, which is another thing that makes you special. Then you have the Leaning Towers of Pisa, or whatever this is. But I just want to mention, I think this is a missed opportunity for some really sexy public art. That, just maybe some wonderful colors or other things, but that could be really special as well. So that's the 4 categories. And I'd be pretty much done if I hadn't been called in to discuss Main Street and your Central Square. But I wanted to show you Concord. Who's been to Concord? Most of you. So Ed Robert is the same engineer who did Concord and turned it from this into this. Right? From that into that. Is working on your team here, so he can do very good work. And I think it's really good evidence of how a nice new streetscape can transform a place from so-so to really great. I wanted to show you this one example, which you'll see I think is quite relevant to you. It's Lancaster, California. It was a 5-lane road, and they came in and they did this to it. My friends Moule and Polizoides, architects in Pasadena, came in and did this to it. And it cost $11.2 million. This was many years ago. This is 2011. It cost $11.2 million. They did not spend that money happily or quickly. Crashes went down by 50%, pedestrian crashes by 78%, pedestrian activity doubled, 57 new businesses opened, 800 new housing units came, 2,000 new jobs came, and they estimate a $282 million economic impact.
Yeah.
So there are points where maybe it makes sense, not just to fix your infrastructure, but to invest in beautifying and making really special, in this case, a linear plaza out of your main street. When it's a farmer's market day, instead of putting it in a parking lot, they just don't allow the parking in the middle, and the farmer's market goes down the middle. So that's a really inspiring opportunity. Now let's talk about your downtown. So I want to make this very clear. I say I spent a lot of time on this talk. Yes, I spent a lot of time on this talk, more than I usually do. I didn't spend a lot of time on a design. I was not hired to do a design. In fact, I should have charged a lot more money for a design, I suppose. But I did a design, but I want you to understand that it's not cooked, right? It's not cooked. It may have problems, and importantly, particularly for the Main Street, it's one of many good possibilities. For Central Square, however, I think I have the best solution, if I can say that. And you know the history of the square. It's a remarkable New England thing. You don't find it almost anywhere else, that your squares tend to be Ys. They tend to be, two streets meet and become one street. That's very common in New England. You find it almost everywhere, like Lexington and Concord. And you know that it's, ignore the Joker in the photograph. It's got this wonderful historic preserved green area in the center, which should stay, needs to stay. Incredible tree cover. A few trees are absolutely giant and make it wonderful. Here's the current configuration. And here's the proposal, which is not a bad proposal. It's really not a bad proposal. It's certainly a better proposal. It increases the amount of open space by, it's like 180% of the current open space. That's good. And having this one little smaller roundabout, as opposed to using the whole square as a roundabout, is a much calmer, more walkable solution. This is definitely an improvement. And it's good. I worry that it could be better. But let me talk a little bit about what's happening here, is that you have the challenge of a 5-road intersection. And that means that you have this very long signal timing. And that long signal timing is one of the things that makes people want to keep Main Street at 4 lanes as opposed to 2 lanes. And whenever you have an extra leg coming into an intersection, you're kind of choking the speed of that intersection. And here are a couple of different studies showing how you could close Washington Street and how would that function. Or, what if you just have an intersection here instead of the roundabout? This was deemed to be just a little too choked and requiring a 4-lane Main Street because it's that 5-way intersection. Now you also have this proposal for a roundabout, which is not much smaller than the roundabout you have to the south. I took it, I clipped it, I cut it out, same scale, and I stuck it in. And you can see it's not so different from the drawing I just showed you. So this is the roundabout you have a couple miles, a mile south, that has now been just dropped in the picture. And you can see how it's not so different from what's being proposed. So that's the sort of circulation you're going to have. It's 2 lanes coming in the current plan, and then it's a 1-lane roundabout otherwise. Excuse me. So you can see the proposed one is a little bit squatter. It's the same width as that roundabout. It looks just like that. I don't love the slip lanes and just the median, and it just feels, remember we talked about vocabulary, and it feels just a little bit, it feels automotive, right? It feels dynamic, like that. So, am I shocking you? The proposal, what this does, by closing a block of, oh, and by the way, the current proposal closes this back street. So it makes a plaza out of this back street in front of these restaurants and the church. What I'm proposing is to close this street, to close Washington, have it come down and dogleg into Court. And what that does is it takes one of the 5 streets and pulls it out of the intersection. So now you have a simple 2-way cross intersection. Notice this is why I talk about angles. It's not a right angle, right? But I would argue that's not more dangerous. You have a simple cross intersection where Roxbury and West meet Main, and you have a simple T intersection. These can each be handled by simple signals. This one certainly needs left turn lanes. This one might not. And I haven't drawn those in this quick drawing. But it's weird, right? I understand it's weird to dogleg a fork into a side road. It's how they fix Times Square. It's how they're going to fix Kenmore Square in Boston. I'm working on that. And it just makes this signal work so well that you then don't need those extra lanes of traffic. So that's the proposal. And can I say that Stantec has told me that it works. Okay? They were kind of steered away from it when they were working with you. But I showed it to them because I work with them, and they like this solution. So from a traffic throughput, from a congestion avoidance strategy. And what that means is you have a simple intersection and a simple intersection. This is actually, it's not a dogleg because it does cross here. The other thing is when you're coming north on Main, you can now go left on West. And when you're coming west on Roxbury, you can now go straight through. And now you're not allowed to do that. So it really just normalizes that intersection. So what does that mean? It means that this block no longer has parking in front of it. Depending on your mood as a restaurateur like Luca, you may appreciate having that extra space to spread out the tables, or you might not like having parking no longer in front of you. I've heard that these restaurants that under the current scheme were going to lose their parking were rather unhappy about it. And maybe Luca will be unhappy about it, but there's only one storefront that really would want that to to keep the street, and it's this one location. Certainly City Hall doesn't need it, and the street kicks right back in about there when it comes across. So I think it works better for the retail. So that's the proposal. I talked about the angle being a little sharp, and we'll see where that goes. Finally, Main Street. This is the currently leading proposal for Main Street. It has the roundabout at the end. It has parking on the outer edge, but no longer on the median. And the reason for that is that it needed to add bike lanes, it needed to preserve the existing trees on the edges, and it needed to maintain 4 lanes of travel. 2-lane travel was considered, 2 lanes of travel was raised. It was not fully considered. It was rejected without analysis, without substantive analysis. If you do the analysis, you see that a 2-lane section does work. God knows, it used to be even huger, right? I mean, this is in the 50s. 6 lanes, and interestingly, parking in the middle. So with this slide, I hope to send the message that the street has always been changing and will continue to change. Here's what it looks like. Here's the current configuration. So what you have is parking on the edges. It's vast. It's 155 feet across here and even wider up there. Of course, it narrows a bit further south, and what happens in the center has to change, as it does now change, as the road narrows. But you see that we're dancing, parking in from the left, parking in from the right. Again, it's limited by the fact you have to have 4 lanes. This is the current proposal, and you can see the parking has been removed from the center. This is the 2-lane version that Stantec put forward that wasn't really studied at any great length, but they did consider it. My concern about this is I think we want the action to be up against the businesses. I don't think we want to create a whole nother place to walk in the middle of the street, because we want people shopping, we want people sheltered, and people are much more likely to be drawn to the edges of the space than to the center of the space. So I don't see a benefit in widening the median, but I do see a benefit in using it for parking, as you currently are. And if you treat it like a plaza and have a ton of trees, and what you see here is, if you look closely, trees, parking, trees, parking, trees, parking. So there's a lot of interruption to the parking. I've proposed trees, park, tree, park, tree, park. So this is my proposal, and it's one of many potentially good proposals, but you can see it's based on this concept. And we keep the curve where it currently is, and only then do we maintain the angle parking on the edge of the street. We're able to insert a bike lane halfway down the sidewalk, or really it's most of the way. So what you're seeing here, let me just explain. What you're seeing here is about 20 feet of sidewalk in front of the stores. Then you have a 6-foot bike lane. Then you have a 6-foot tree buffer. Then you have the angle parking spaces. Then you have a single driving lane. And then here you have a middle that's like Lancaster, California, with angle parking coming in from both sides. Then the same thing repeats. Again, it's one of many options. It's the one that I chose as just most obvious to me. It gives the opportunity to have a ton of trees, and this drawing does not consider, as it must, saving the existing trees in the median, which that has to happen first. The trees in the median that have a chance at staying alive, which is, I don't know, maybe half of them, the plan needs to in my opinion, the plan needs to lay itself on top of that and save those trees. Now, by the way, the existing condition in this picture only, not looking backwards, has 75 parking stalls in it. The proposal has 35 parking stalls in it. Now, there are ways that this gets evened out elsewhere in the plan, but it's a reduction of parking on this most important segment of the main street. My proposal actually kind of basically matches the current number of stalls. I do think that's important. And as I said, the place to begin is this, I'd love to preserve this granite curve and just build everything beyond the curve, and even try not to dig up what's in front of the stores, particularly when there's a tree there. Lay all the utilities into the tarmac as you rebuild them, and then only cut stuff up when you need to go laterally into a business. And you can do that obviously between trees. I happen to really like this. It's not exactly urban, right? It's a little bit countrified, but I happen to really like the continuous green that you have, and it makes you different from a lot of other places. And again, being inspired by Greenville and what you can do with a lot of trees, being inspired by Lancaster, California. And I got the Jumanji curse. It's definitely runnable, but mostly we're going to end vehicular dominance. And then you'll forgive me, but you have a building like no other building that I've seen in a city that is the Cojones building. So, I really hope that you'll look to the future and see this as an opportunity. I do think, as I said in the paper, I do think it's a mistake to spend $15 million on your infrastructure and not make the surface as amazing as it can be, even if it costs a little bit more, because you'll make it back. And I want to share some resources with you before I conclude. They are selling Walkable Cities out there. That's the book if you want to convince other people about why walkability is important, or you just want a fun beach read. It was designed to be fun to read. If you're more technical, please read Walkable City Rules. If you're doing the work, which are these steps that are 101 individual things, like replace signals with always stops. The TED Talk on why walkability, but there's another TED Talk that's more like the one I gave tonight on how to achieve it. You can find them both under my name. And then finally, it's short notice, but once a year I teach a class at Harvard that anyone can take, and it happens to be Thursday and Friday of this week. So if you want to come down, let me know. You can still enroll. You can still enroll in this class. And all these resources and a lot of others are available at my website, which is just jeffspeck.com. But I want to end with this is going to seem, this will sound like a rhetorical question, but it's actually a real question. Because I talked to Portsmouth a while back, and they were really cooking. And then, what was it, J. Crew came in, I think. And it started to change the nature of the city. And I actually asked them, I said, how good do you want to be? because when you make changes like this, you will inevitably kick it to the next level, and things will get fancier. And I'm not certain that's the right outcome. You know, I mean, if you want to have this amazing, more tourist attracting, more successful for retail downtown, then by all means, you know, take my advice. But also, you know, I do want to ask the question, you know, do you want to change? Because it will change what you are. I think in a very positive way. But it'll be a positive way that works for everybody if it has a ton more housing in it. And I think that's what we need to remember. You know, it took me 20 years to realize that my job was to gentrify. And let me explain. As an urban designer, it's my job to try and make places better. When you make them better, they're more valued. When they're more valued, they're more expensive. When they're more expensive, sometimes people get displaced. And if you make those moves without taking provisions to stem displacement or to provide more housing, then actually you risk, you're not allowing people to rise with the ship that you've lifted. And so particularly a place like this that's kind of cooking on medium, I think it's beholden to you as you make these improvements to think about maintaining, you know, current residents. The best way to do that is to, well, actually, in Walkable City Rules, I talk about 4 different types of programs that cities use to, you know, like property tax abatement and turning renters into owners and other things. Great ways to do that. I talk about techniques that cities use to preserve existing residents. But the best thing you can do is add a whole bunch of housing, which is what our economy needs anyway, and our cities need anyway. So with that caveat and warning, I have completed my talk, and I'm looking forward to questions. Do you want to moderate the questions?
Sure. Don?
And there's a mic that we can pass around. Now, if you need to go, I know I ran long. If you need to go, I will not be insulted by your leader.
Hello. Hey, Jeff, thank you very much. So we're just going to take some questions. So very quick, Jeff has offered to spend tomorrow morning with us for about an hour and a half from 8:30 to 10. A small group of people. We have a room picked out, not super big, but if anybody would like to come, it'll be a breakfast meeting. Just come up after Jeff is done, talk to Todd, Mark, or Jen, or me, because we want to fit in as many as we can, but we'll have to kind of take reservations. So downtown it's going to be at the hotel. So we'll talk about it, but just come up when Jeff is done and we'll tell you more about it. Jeff, you got it.
So, questions?
Very quick observation, and I've been involved with the planning visions.
Hold it karaoke style.
Yeah. Thank you. This is an observation, and that what's really welcome in your presentation is that you're a planner and not a traffic engineer, and that's what we've been dealing with. And you're taking the big picture all the way up to the housing and all, which is really the key pieces of what makes a downtown. So, thank you.
I know there's some engineers in the audience, and I usually single them out for unique derision. But I just want to make it clear that everything I say about that had to do with traffic engineering, I learned from traffic engineers. The profession is really changing. It's amazing to me in 30 years how much the traffic engineering profession has changed. And now most communities I go into, there is not the hand in the face that we used to get when we proposed these safer solutions.
Hi, thank you. Everything resonated with me, and I think with a lot of people, so thank you. What resonated most was the discussion on housing, and we do need housing, and I think, when I think about it, Keene, this whole region is aging. When we look at the future growth, it's actually going to maybe decline. And so the idea of bringing housing and opportunity and jobs and all that development land that you showed, I think people don't see that. We keep hearing there's no place to build in Keene. But you just demonstrated there's a lot of places to build. So I think by having people in town, then they would energize the downtown, they would energize the business, and good restaurants at night, all that stuff. So, and maybe not need so many cars. So I hope we all think about that and think about that as a way to get housing at all different levels. Thank you.
So without much time, I didn't look at those different sites where the housing went in my little map. But I do know that some of them, the biggest ones, are city-owned. So that seems to be like a real opportunity. If you're gonna ask, you gotta say no.
Listen, how much do you take public transport into account when you're designing cities?
Well, every city is different, and some cities have a ton of public transportation, and others, like yours, have a lot less. Let me just say, in the design of streets, it's the rare street where it does make sense to put in an extra lane for a bus rapid transit or some other type of vehicle. But for a place like your main street, the best solution for buses is to mix in with the traffic and just be part of the cars, part of the vehicles moving on the street. So we consider it in the sense that we first ask the question if dedicated facilities are appropriate. But once if we determine that they're not, then we move on because we know that they'll be sharing the facility.
Thank you very much of this. I like of walking on West Street when it's wide. You can walk on it. When it gets to School Street, you can't walk on them together. So are you thinking about when you're doing that idea, would they be wider wise, that people could be walking on those areas?
Does it get worse because the sidewalk narrows?
It narrows after School Street.
So given all that you're spending on Main Street and Central Square, I wasn't proposing a rebuild for West Street. So I was just trying to make the most of the space we had between the curves. However, it's not that hard. For example, I proposed for that, well, let me think about this. I proposed for the western segment, where I went from 4 lanes to 3, bike lanes that could be protected in a way that would also protect the sidewalk. For example, heading east, I hadn't considered widening the sidewalk because I didn't want to spend that money, but I think that's certainly something that we can take into consideration.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I've been an advocate for years for the 10 smart growth principles.
I didn't know there were 10.
And
I wrote a book called The Smart Growth Manual. I didn't know there were 10.
well, you wrote a long time ago. And I used to have them memorized, but number 4 was be a walkable city. And I think that's part, and I just want to know, are you an advocate for the smart growth principles? And that's what gets us away, and you mentioned the Euclidean process, that's what gets us away from the Euclidean process. That's where we need to be.
So yeah, I did write a book with my colleagues called The Smart Growth Manual, where we did narrow it down to those 10 principles, but we learned from the original, the best, which was Paris Glendening, who was the governor of Maryland. And he was the first major US governor to take a stand to say, hey, you're free to, municipalities in our state, you're free to sprawl if you want, but the state's not going to pay for it. And that actually made a big difference in terms of where the sewage lines were going, where the electrical wiring was going, that sort of thing. For those of you who aren't familiar, smart growth is essentially, for want of a simpler explanation, about focusing growth within our existing city centers, trying to stem the spread of urban sprawl, and of course advocating for better transit, for density on transit, for transit on density, and for stemming what is happening in most American cities, which is that the city centers are actively, secretly subsidizing the peripheral areas in ways that are hidden, and we're trying to stop that for a long time.
Thank you.
Hi. Am I on? Okay. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. And I guess my question, I'm going to see if I can phrase this correctly, but you had talked at one point about planning a travel route when you were driving from Main Street and kind of ending up going 3 different ways, and it was 10 minutes any which way, which basically means that it's directing, you know, it's kind of a coin toss which way you go. And talking about traffic adjusting to the roadways. And so that if you decrease basically the capacity that Main Street can hold, and it's just as quick to go another way, it becomes faster to go that way than it would on Main Street. Is that kind of the gist of?
You heard that correctly.
Okay, so my question is, I guess, do you think that that is true for pedestrian traffic as well, that people could essentially be deterred from going one way if, let's say, it takes a long time to cross the street, or you can't get, you know, do you think that that would be true as well?
Well, as I hope I made clear today, I've spent my career trying to figure out why pedestrians, and I wish I had even more data, but trying to figure out why pedestrians make the choices they make about where to walk. And I think, some people don't have a choice, right? So you'd be surprised at some of the horrible places that don't satisfy my 4 criteria where you still find pedestrians. But if the goal is to create a place with a lot of pedestrian activity, then there are those 4 categories of useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting that you want to satisfy. Pedestrians, though, almost always take the most direct path, almost always. So you want to make sure the more direct paths are well amenitized, because people are going to be on them anyway. It's a rare pedestrian, except a tourist, who will meander off the straightest line, which is why you often see greens with raccoon paths across the middle, right, made by pedestrians. But I just want to put a finer point on how you began this, which is, in case I didn't explain it fully. First of all, I'm not proposing that we reduce the throughput on Main Street. I'm proposing that we basically match the road capacity to the current number of trips in a way that's more efficient. But secondly, yes, I want to make the point that others won't tell you, which is that people will adjust their behavior. And you can have the downtown you want. You really can. And the cars will figure it out.
So kind of half laughing. So I am a lifelong pedestrian, not by choice. But I've noticed that, so I've actually timed myself how long it takes to go around the circle. And it takes about 7.5 minutes based on, which basically meant that when I moved across the street, I switched my coffee shop because it took too long to get across the street.
By the circle, you mean Central Square.
Yes.
So let me say, we noticed this today, that the way the signals work there, unless you sprint, you're only going to make it halfway, right? So that is something that the roundabout would improve, and it's something that my proposal would also fix. But yeah, right now, it doesn't feel like it's made for pedestrians.
Hi, Jeff. Well, I'm a business owner in downtown, so when I saw your proposal, I heard the size, and everybody saying, well, we weren't expecting that, but I guess my adjective is, it's interesting. But I guess my question is, the intersection that you proposed for Main, Roxbury, and Main, that kind of 4-corner intersection, would you propose a traffic signal there or stop signs?
So I talked to the Stantec traffic modelers. See, my secret sauce for this presentation is that I'm already friends with the Stantec people. And I work with them already. I never worked with Ed Roberge, who's your main guy, but I talked to him, I talked to his office. So I was able, rather than just shooting in the dark, I was able to run things by them and get their responses. I would love for your main to be just stop signs, but everyone's convinced that would not work. It's just too many trips. And certainly in terms of what technical manuals tell you warrants a a signal versus a stop sign, you have many more trips. And it does happen that a signal with a left turn lane processes a lot more cars than an all-way stop sign. So it seems rather certain that the Roxbury West main intersection, which is really now west, going up Court Street, right? It's angled west of Court Street. That would need to have 3 lanes entering in from every direction, which isn't horrible. It's 30 feet of cars. They're not sure about where what's the top street called? The one that sits in front of the church?
That's Central Square.
It's Central Square Street. Where that crosses Court, probably, almost certainly needs a signal, might not need left turn lanes. Yeah. That's what I heard.
Hi, thanks for being here. It's really great. My concern has been since the beginning, I went to the other meetings as well. The bike lanes, I'm a runner, I'm a cyclist, and I love the thought of the bike lanes going down, but I wonder in all of your studies, it seems to me that when cars pull up to park and then you have a bike lane and then the sidewalk and the businesses, that would be really dangerous, especially for some pedestrians.
I almost got hit in that circumstance at a new development called The Wharf, which is on the southwest waterfront in DC, because I was visiting for the first time. And you're right, it takes some getting used to. However, the cyclists become aware that you'll have straight pedestrians, and if you properly, wayfind the bike lanes, make them very clear, make sure the materials are different, and have all the right signs, those collisions will be infrequent or hopefully none. But the model that we're proposing, where the bike lane is between the parking and the curb, has become the standard and is considered the safest way to have bikes in the roadway. So it's easy intuitively to imagine a conflict, but the outcome for all road users, not just for bicyclists, but for pedestrians and bicyclists and drivers, statistically, it's that is the safest configuration.
Thank you for coming to Keene. Thank you for a great presentation. We have a situation where we have a lot of festivals, and the festivals require an incredible amount of city engagement in terms of moving these huge dirt and barriers and all of that. And I wonder if you had contemplated the benefits to easier, cheaper festivals because less turkey barriers. I wonder if you could just comment.
I haven't thought about those barriers, and maybe this won't be answering your question, but the reason I lean towards the Lancaster, California model for my proposal was that it effectively allows the whole street to be usable, even in a parade. That you could march people, there would be trees between, ranks, but it allows tremendous flexibility, as opposed to what you have now with that S-shaped green stripe between people parking from the left and the right, really limits your choice of that roadway. So I do like a solution that has a parking plaza in the center, still with trees, but that allows more flexible use.
Jeff, you showed single lane on Main Street going north and single lane going south.
Yes.
So diagonal parking from either side.
Yes.
That doesn't seem like that would work.
It does.
Good enough. Expound, please.
My friends from Stantec told me that my 12-foot lane was not wide enough, and I showed them where it was, but they would suggest a 14-foot lane. There's so much room in that streetscape that there's a couple feet here that isn't gonna wreck the proposal. But no, I can show you. I can dig into the files and show you examples of angle parking on two sides of a one-way. And, you know, what matters is that the lane is the proper width, so that A, people aren't speeding, but B, when you back out, you aren't hitting the car on the other side.
One positive aspect of roundabouts is that there's less idling, so there's less pollution. And Keene has a really big pollution problem as a whole. Do you feel like a lot of your proposals will make that a little bit better?
You've hit the Achilles heel of my stop sign work. And it's absolutely true that a roundabout city will have less pollution than a stop sign city, unless you consider second order impacts. And the fact that I believe that when you create a wonderful environment where more people choose to walk, they won't get in a car at all.
Right.
So yes, if you look at the microcosm, a roundabout is cleaner than a stop sign. If you look at the macrocosm and how many people are choosing to walk or bike versus drive, I'd like to think that by making a more walkable environment, we're actually doing more to save the planet.
Stop signs are cleaner than lights then, right?
Stop signs are cleaner than lights because actually no one really stops.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't have to wait for them to cycle.
And by the way, on Twitter, you know, people are like, this is horrible. You know, every day on Twitter I get a post of someone complaining that someone is rolling through an always stop sign. I'm like, so they're breaking the law, but I don't talk about bicycles, I'm talking about cars, right? They're breaking the law, but actually no one's getting hurt. There's no crashes. It's very safe. Everyone's just kind of, it's basically a yield, right? Everyone's yielding to everyone else, which is a wonderful outcome. Yes? Stand up, please. I can see you.
Two things. One is, if you're bringing in more housing, you take.
Talk a little closer to your mouth.
Sorry.
Perfect.
If you're bringing in more housing, you take into account in your plan for the traffic, how many more cars might be coming in with that. And I know that they ideally will be using the downtown in a pedestrian way, but they'll presumably be using their cars for the transit.
So this is the great self-fulfilling prophecy of traffic studies, which is these days before you add a single, parking space to a main street or a apartment building to a downtown, they often make you do traffic models that show you, that cause you to build more roadway in anticipation of those new residents. The problem though is that when you build that new roadway, more people choose to drive. So it is a self-fulfilling prophecy that as Jan Gehl says, famous Scandinavian planner, through the 20th century, cars behaved like water, and where cities gave them more space, they took more space, and where cities gave them less space, they took less space. And you can decide the sort of city you want to have, and the drivers will respond. So the question, will you expand capacity in anticipation of more residents, is a way to ensure that you become a driving city. And as Fred Kent said, if you plan for people and places, you get people and places. If you plan for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic.
Yeah, I really like your proposal, but if there's a single lane and then there's deliveries or people pulling out that are having a hard time pulling out or pulling in, there are lots of ways that the traffic can be blocked. And normally with 2 lanes, it just go around. So what happens in this case?
So the other Achilles heel that we can fix, so we call this one the third fist, because you block the first 2 fists and then loading zones. Because what happens on these one-way, we've done a lot of one-way to 2-way conversions, like in downtown Lowell, where they told us we couldn't make Merrimack Street 2-way because it was only 2 lanes and the beer trucks were always parked. And we couldn't figure it out until we realized, we have to designate loading zones. So you take a certain number of those parking spaces and you make them designated loading zones. Sometimes it involves a little detail where you have to have a longer place as opposed to a diagonal place, but you have to design that in so that every block there's a place for the trucks to go, and then you're able to solve that problem. The biggest concern probably is emergency response.
Yes.
and wanting to have that extra lane. The big picture, of course, is that, you know, half the emergencies we have are car crashes, and wouldn't it be nice to have fewer of those? However, you know, the limiting of that extra lane does reduce the freedom for the emergency equipment, and I think that's a balancing act. You know, there are plenty of other main streets that across America that only have one lane in each direction, and they function perfectly well. It does require some creative thinking on the part of the emergency personnel. Worst case scenario, you can run equipment down the bike lane. Honestly, if you design a nice wide bike lane, that can become a stopgap. But I don't want to offer that up just yet. But I do know, and I'm looking at the fire or police chief back there. I do know that you know, having a progressive emergency response team is part of this challenge.
Hi, thank you. One of the concerns I've heard people express is that if it's slower to go down Main Street, people are going to be taking shortcuts up through the neighborhood and through East Keene. And I imagine maybe even emergency vehicles want to do that, now that you mention it. And I'm wondering if you think that's a good thing or a not good thing, you know, for the smaller residential streets to absorb some of that traffic.
What I've noticed now, and you probably have too, if you've been an Uber passenger, is that you end up, or you're just following Google Maps, is you end up driving down some residential neighborhoods just to get where you're going, like every day. And certain residential neighborhoods can get overrun with pass-through traffic. I think that has to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. I think what you're saying is sound, that there's a risk of that. So, you know, we need to keep an eye on it. And if certain residential or other local streets become overburdened, then there need to be rules, as we've seen in many neighborhoods, you know, certain hours you can't cut through and other things. So I'm not going to suggest that it won't happen, but there are ways to correct for it.
Hi Jeff, thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for the folks who organized it. It's really been a wonderful event. I want to ask a karaoke question, but I'll save that for later. You seem to be an enthusiast, so I'm curious what your go-to jam is.
All of our hearings in Hyannis were on Wednesday night, because that's when embargo had karaoke.
Nice. We'll chat later. So yeah, this has been a great event. I really appreciate sort of the academic nature. I think this project's been beset by some knee-jerk reactions, and as a person who's pretty enthusiastic about some of the creative aspects of our planning here, I've been downhearted by the reactions, and found myself on sort of the opposite side of people I'm generally on the same side of with political planning decisions. So hope that I can be heard, but a good chance to look at this from some fresh eyes, through some academic eyes, and see that there are abilities for us to make a beautiful, workable downtown that works for us all. So I'll leave it, not really a question, I guess, but a comment, and thanks to the organizer for this event. Thank you.
I should mention there's an alternate scheme that I didn't show, that I didn't model. If very few trees can be saved in the median, like none, almost none, then there might be a solution that pushes everything towards the center, does not split the travel. That's still 2 lanes with occasional left turn lanes, but it gives you super deep sidewalks on either side, and angled parking on either side. It reduces the parking somewhat, because then you don't get 2 flanks of parking, you don't get 4 flanks of parking, you get 2 flanks of parking. But for example, if 1 lane each direction is deemed unworkable, then that's another solution that's not the end of the world. It's pretty nice.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the bicycling aspect of the thinking about the plan for downtown. You probably have become somewhat familiar with the bike path system.
No, I haven't.
No. Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you about. I was going to ask you a question about the networking, street network, and how it relates to the downtown and your thoughts on the design perhaps. There is a, right by Gilbo Ave is a east-west rail trail path. And I think the consultant, Stantec, were recommending a race table there. I'm wondering with the single lane in either direction, if that's really needed. Maybe go to your design. And also, if mostly I wanted to ask you about the network and how it relates to the design. If you haven't had a chance to.
My simple reaction to Main Street is that it's a key corridor. It's very dangerous to bicycle behind front in angle parked cars. That's why a lot of cities are putting in rear angle parking, which I always tell cities they should have it, but I don't want to be the one that brings it to you because everyone hates it. And then certain people use it, but if you're going to have a main shopping street with angle parking, then really the bike lanes need to be on the outside of that, not on the inside.
Out of traffic.
Yeah. Have I exhausted you?
Going once, going twice.
Let's take one, there's one in the back there, let's take one more.
Adam, Mike. With respect to the lights being between the parking stalls and the building face, do you have a thought on whether the bike lane is at the sidewalk elevation or at the street elevation?
So, not really, but if you put it at the street elevation, this fear that was stated over here, that pedestrians would stumble into it, becomes less likely, right? So, if it's actively distanced from the front of the cars that are parked and properly spaced from the sidewalk with a tree strip, as my plan proposes, it works fine either way. But there's certainly no harm to having it lowered a bit, and that helps send a signal to pedestrians that it's not a sidewalk facility.
Okay, so thank you very much.